Okay, welcome to our evening service. It's good to see you here. I'm looking forward to our time of hearing some history that we don't hear that frequently, unless you're in Jacob's, class or some other places you might hear these things. But I did not myself have the privilege of having an education that included this sort of thing. So looking forward to it. I do have one song that I'll be leading, and I was thinking about this song, the thing that, so I shared this morning about some of the things that excite me about the Anabaptist vision, and there's some things that have troubled me too, and one of them is looking at the fragmentation that the movement, Anabaptist movement, has experienced, along with other church groups. It's not unique to the Anabaptist movement, but certainly you would think that some of the values or fundamentals of the vision, you would think maybe that unity would be a stronger theme than fragmentation. And I think there's probably reasons why we can identify why right away there tended to be division. Some of that probably was connected to the new way of doing church and the demand for purity in the church and things like that. But as I think about today, I think about recognizing that history, and it hasn't been a completely destructive factor. But I would love if the next 500 years, if the Lord tarries, if the Anabaptist movement would be characterized by a unity and a coming together that stands in contrast to other religious movements in the world. I would love if that would be the testimony of our future, even recognizing the challenge that has been in the past. So that led to 350 is the song I'd like to sing out of the hymns of the church. I don't know if it's a super familiar song to us. I think we've sang it a few times here, so hopefully we know it well enough to sing it. But this idea of, I think, that the theme being the unity of the church, and I hope that is part of our desire and what defines us in the years to come. Number 350. If you would just stand together so we can bring all the voice that we have in our smaller group here tonight. Heart with loving heart united, met to know God's holy will. Let His love in us ignited, more and more our spirits fill. He the head, we are His members, we reflect the light He is. He the master, we the brothers. He is ours and we are His. May we also love each other and all selfish claims deny, that the brother for the brother will not hesitate to die. Even so our Lord has loved us, for our lives He shed His blood. Still He grieves and still He suffers when we mar the brotherhood. Since, O Lord, you have demanded that our lives your love should show, so we wait to be most compassion, so that everyone may see in our fellowship the promise of the new humanity. You may be seated. We'll look to Dan for our content tonight.
Good evening to all of you who are here, and perhaps there are people from our congregation that are viewing this on live stream. If you are, good evening to you as well. Those of you who are present, I'm glad you're here. It makes me feel like I'm teaching in a class rather than just live streaming something. That's a good feeling for me to have. Today, our sort of overall theme has been for 500 years of Anabaptism, from January of 1525 to January of 2025, 500 years. And we spent time this morning looking at the origins of Anabaptism in Switzerland in 1525, some of the things that led up to that, some of the immediate aftermath of the Anabaptist movement, the people who participated and the cost there. And then also we have looked at Anabaptist sort of distinctive beliefs, some of the essential beliefs, and hopefully we're inspired to continue what we have received after 500 years. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about how things, in a quick sort of way, how things developed from Switzerland to Pennsylvania. And I'm calling this an overview of our history. One of the things about history, I think, that's important to understand is that history explains, the past explains the present. Okay, here we are sitting in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. How did we come to be here? That's a little bit what I think is important. And the other thing I want to just make sure right up front here, I liked very much that Levon, especially, I think, came through loud and clear this morning in the part that he shared, is that we have a community. And it's a community that is, it's a community that's shaped and founded on Jesus Christ and on our commitment to being a disciple of Jesus Christ. That's one of the things, if not the most essential thing, certainly one of the foundations of our community. And that is not somehow limited. Jesus' invitation is to everyone, and so our community is not somehow closed. All right. So, and yet it's also a historical fact that many people in this community of Mennonites and Amish in Lancaster County do come from a specific ethnic origin. All right, and so I want to be very clear tonight. Mennonite, Amish, they're not ethnic terms. All right, anybody can be a Mennonite. Anybody can join our community, and some of you have. Some of the people here don't come from the same ethnic background, which I call Pennsylvania German, that I come from. And that's okay. And it doesn't mean you're any more or less part of our community. We're all part of the community together. So I just want to make it clear, there are aspects of our identity that are shaped by our ethnicity, if you will. All right, Levon mentioned that it is more to being a Mennonite than, what did he say, 4-part harmony and buttered noodles? Okay, he's right. There's ham loaf too. Or maybe it's schnitz pie. I don't know, but the point I'm trying to make is those are cultural markers of an ethnicity. There's nothing inherently Mennonite about buttered noodles, as far as I can tell. It's a Pennsylvania Dutch thing, or Pennsylvania German thing, and most Pennsylvania Germans weren't Anabaptists ever, and still aren't. So all I'm saying by that is, I want to be clear, as I look at the story of our community, it is true that many of the people in this story do come from a specific Swiss-German background. They came to America in the 17 and in some cases the 1800s. All right? And it's that story. And if you aren't one and you're still part of our community, hopefully it will help explain some of us, okay? Because the past explains the present. All right? The past explains the present. So that's my little sort of intro before the intro. All right? How we find ourselves here. So I'm going to step back. We talked about this morning, the Anabaptist movement begins in Switzerland, and for a period of several decades, almost a full century, it could cost you your life to be an Anabaptist in Switzerland. It could. Obviously, not all of the Anabaptists were executed, all right? But some were. And if you were called to leadership, if you were a man who was called to leadership, your chances of being, of suffering and possibly being executed were higher, right? So that's who the authorities went for. Gradually, by the latter part of the 1500s, the governments in Switzerland began to say, to some degree, this isn't working and it isn't worth it, because there tends to be public outcry when we have these honest, upright men executed for matters of faith. They become a testimony that wins other people to their faith in these public executions. Right? And so after the year 1600, there were very few executions. In fact, in the last execution that I can find record of in Switzerland of an Anabaptist leader happened in 1614, in September. An Anabaptist leader named Hans Landis was executed by beheading in Zurich, Switzerland in 1614. The outcry, even in other places, over that was enough that the Swiss authorities in Zurich never executed anyone else for Anabaptism. And the authorities in other cantons sort of followed suit. But there's still a lot of persecution. They switched their method, okay? It wouldn't cost you your life, but being an Anabaptist could cost you your home. That was their preferred thing, was to round these people up and exile them. When they found that sometimes the people would simply return, sometimes they would do other things. They tried to move them further away, all right? By the early 1700s, there was even talk sometimes of making them go to America as prisoners, which is something that the English government was doing. Anabaptists in Switzerland were pushed to the margins, all right? And by the mid 1660s, there was a severe crackdown, I guess is better, Anabaptism in Zurich, and pretty much the Zurich Anabaptist movement ended. The people who weren't imprisoned and they weren't being executed, they were being exiled, wound up having to move. There was really no Mennonite or Anabaptist church there. In the canton of Bern, things were a little different. The government there didn't take quite the same approach. And there, Anabaptism hung on, especially in some of the sort of remoter areas of the canton, the mountainous areas where it was a little more easy to sort of lay low and just sort of live. And in the context here as well, that the authorities depended on pastors and local, like, I don't know what the word would be in English today, maybe sheriff, sort of a local law enforcement officer, to sort of keep tabs on who's an Anabaptist. And in some areas, those men had no real desire to turn people in because they knew that the general public perception was that Anabaptists are harmless, They are innocent of any real crime, and they're very godly people. And so they should not pay any penalties. Anabaptists tended to be pushed to the margins, but they were sort of often tolerated as long as, I don't know, different times. Like I said, Hans Landis, when he was executed, they never did it again, all right, because of the public outcry. Later in the 1600s, and there's some more sort of Anabaptist evangelization, and then the government sort of would crack down again and try to at least get the leadership out. It was kind of a back and forth, and the canton of Bern never actually ended all of Anabaptism. Maybe just take a time to make a note too. The Anabaptists in Switzerland never used the name Mennonite in this era of time. Menno was not their leader. Menno was a Dutch leader. They didn't come from Holland. And so the term that they preferred to use was simply brothers and sisters. And they became known as the Swiss Brethren because that's where they were from. The government referred to them eventually as, called them in their language Taufe, which means Baptist. And that name eventually kind of stuck. And they did kind of use that name. And even to this day, I understand, would use the name Taufe, although I think they now sometimes call themselves the Alt-Taufe, which is the old Baptists, because the more modern day Baptists, like we have, you know, everywhere, right? Baptism is a huge movement, religious movement in our country and many others, have affiliates in Europe as well. These are the old Baptists, all right, because their roots go back to the 1500s. Switzerland was not really always a safe place and not an easy place in which to live. Anabaptists didn't have a lot of civil rights, and various times the governments would crack down and try to exile people. And so they did certainly seek for havens in Europe. They sought places they could go where the government policies were not as severe. Right? One of the places they went sometimes was Moravia. Moravia, we find record of them moving there already in the 1530s. That lasted almost 100 years. The nobles in Moravia were very tolerant. They were Protestants, and they had no problem with Anabaptists. And so a lot of Anabaptists moved there. Many of them accepted leadership from a man named Jakob Hutter, and so they became known as the Hutterian Brethren or the Hutterites. In the 1600s, due to warfare and some changes in government, the Moravia was no longer a safe place to live, and the Anabaptists who didn't get killed in some of that setting mostly had to flee. The Netherlands also became a place where some went from Switzerland, not very many really. The Dutch government around 1579 adopted a policy of toleration, and the Anabaptists in the Netherlands after that were not really persecuted anymore. There were restrictions on them because they didn't belong to the right church, but it was not persecution. However, because of the language differences and all, most Swiss Mennonites or Swiss Anabaptists did not wish to go to the Netherlands to live. The area in between, starting in the mid-1600s, is where many of them went. This is an area called the Palatinate, or in German, the Pfalz. And also, I should say, the neighboring area right on the other side of the Rhine River, which is kind of in here, it's called Alsace. Those areas, the nobles, in the mid-1600s, following a very, very lengthy series of wars that's collectively called the 30 Years' War, in which this area was absolutely devastated over many years of fighting, decades of fighting. Whole areas were depopulated, and the land was turning back into wilderness. The nobles, after this was finally over in 1648, said, we need people who can reclaim the land and farm here. And they threw the invitation open to the Anabaptists. He said, if you may come and live here and farm, we'll give you land on which you can farm. You can kind of reclaim the land. That was something Anabaptists were pretty good at, because in Switzerland they were used to farming hard to farm areas because that's where they had to live for safety. Right? Mountainous areas and so on were hard to farm. So the governments there said, you may come, but they always put conditions on it. Usually they said, you can come, but you're going to have to pay some special taxes to live here, to avoid military duty and things like that. You're allowed to worship in your homes and in your farms, but you may not build church buildings. You may not seek to convert people from the state church. And in some cases, they also had caps on how many Anabaptists could live in a certain area. And so there were always conditions on this toleration. And there was also always a sense of a tension there because, number one, all of this was on the sufferance of the ruler in charge. If the ruler in charge had a change of heart, or if the ruler in charge died and was replaced by another ruler, everything could change. There was no certainty there. And the other thing was that most of the people who'd lived there before, who were part of the state church, tended to sometimes resent the Anabaptists. They looked down on them because they didn't believe the right things, and they also were sometimes, I think, a bit jealous of them for getting some of the privileges that the rulers gave them, and especially in settings when there was a scarcity of land. There were often tensions with the people who lived there. Some of the rulers of the Palatinate were Reformed, Calvinist, Protestants, and then eventually some of them sort of switched, and then some were Catholic. The state church in the area was always Reformed. In Alsace, in the early 1700s, the government of France took it over in the late 1600s, actually, passed a rule that said all the Anabaptists have to leave, but then they didn't actually enforce it. So, but this is the area that many of the Swiss Anabaptists wound up moving to if they were exiled, pushed out, or if they just decided they'd had enough and wanted a place to go where they could live and raise a family and so on. It's in this context that there is, oh, I'm sorry, I have a slide here that shows a little more. Here's Bern, Switzerland. All right, it's the canton of Bern. And then we have the couple little areas where Anabaptists settled in the Alsace area, which today is part of France. It was not part of France then, but the French king conquered it in the 1680s. And then we have the Palatinate proper, this area here, especially called the Kraichgau, with towns like Heidelberg and also Mannheim would be places that are named this area because of immigration from that area in Europe. Karl Ludwig was the elector of the Palatinate in the 1660s. He put out a document saying that this has been happening and we want it to continue to allow these kinds of people to live here. And he made a distinction, an interesting distinction. He said, we're not allowing in Anabaptists because that's against the law. But these are Mennonites or Menists. And so they're not a menace, they're Menists or Mennonists. And so they're a different variety and they're okay. This is the first time where the people of Swiss background really start to adopt that name Mennonite or Mennonist. And it's sort of because it has a sort of almost legal charter that says if you're one of this, you can live, you can be tolerated. So they lived on their farms and they farmed and really did make the Palatinate flourish again as they reclaimed the land. It's in this context, too, we have a division among the Swiss Anabaptists and the ones in the Palatinate and the Alsace areas. And this is usually referred to as the Amish division. And I don't want to get into a lot of this because obviously I could talk all night here and you all don't have all night. I don't really have all night either, but you know what I mean. In the 1660s and 70s, there was sort of not an outbreak, that's the wrong word, a revival of sorts among some of the Anabaptists in Bern. All right, and a lot of Swiss Reformed church members were sort of hearing the Anabaptist message, and particularly associated with a man who was named Ulrich Miller. And he had a ministry, and eventually he wound up moving to the Alsace area in the 1680s. But he did get a lot of people were joining the Anabaptists, were being rebaptized. There was an established group in the Emmental, the Emmen Valley, but a lot of these other people came from the Oberland, which is the upper land. And so they were a little different. They came from different areas. And they weren't exactly the same, but they believed the same. They were in communion with one another. One of the men who converted from the State Reformed Church to the Anabaptist movement was a man named Jacob Ammon. We don't know what he looked like, but here's an artist in the 21st century drew this to represent Jacob Ammon, or Jacob Ammon. In the year 1679, he was rebaptized. It's not clear that the rest of his family was. His wife may have been. We really don't know. I also think he had a brother named Ulrich who was rebaptized. And both of these men were called to the leadership in this area when they moved here in the 1680s. There was a lot of back and forth between these areas, and as far as it goes, back and forth, and also out here in the Kraichgau, where there were a lot of people from Zurich background. Eventually, a number of issues came up, though. The Swiss Anabaptists, for purposes of sort of representing their beliefs to the government, had adopted the Dordrecht Confession of Faith, which the Dutch Anabaptists, and mostly Mennonites there, had drawn up in 1632, and in 1660, here in the Palatinate, a number of the ministry signed off that this is what we believe as well. One of the things that was in there was the practice of feet washing, which the Swiss had never really done. And one of the issues also was that if a person, it says, who falls into error, either in life or in doctrine, and will not repent after being admonished by the church, persists in that error, that person is put under the ban or excommunicated. But what the Dutch believed, and most of them to some degree practiced here, was that if a person is in that setting, that the person would sort of be shunned in daily life. They would not eat meals together or do business together or things like that. And this was seen as a way to hopefully drive home the point that this person who is under the ban, who has fallen into sin and will not repent, has kind of broken the tie in the community there, and you're not part of it anymore, and it affects all of life. The Swiss did not ever do that. They believed in excommunicating people who fell into sin, sort of saying you don't take communion, you're not really part of our group anymore, but that was it. They didn't really ever do this sort of shunning. But Jacob Ammon thought they should. Thought it would be a good thing to do to drive home the point of the sin, and also he says it's in our confession of faith. We agreed this is part of it. And so in 1693 and 1694, he and a number of ministers from the Alsace area kind of went back to Switzerland, which, by the way, this was a very intense time for the Mennonite or the Anabaptists there. A lot of government. He did this at a high risk of being arrested, and because he was himself a convert, it could have gone badly for him if he had been arrested, but he was not. But he made several trips to try to convince the Swiss down here to kind of start doing these things. The Swiss were okay to some degree with feet washing. They were not willing to shun people under the ban, by and large. And by and large, the ministry in the Alsace area did support Ammon and his group, and the ones in the Palatinate were sort of split on it. And the result was the two sides in 1694 kind of excommunicated each other. The leadership kind of did. The congregations didn't always have much to do, but Jacob Ammon was pretty emphatic on it. He seems to have been kind of a person who was maybe a little stubborn about some things and confident in the correctness of his understanding of the scriptures on this. And the result was a sort of a division in their community that divided even families. After a couple years, there were efforts made to bring the sides together. They just never quite worked. And by around 1700 or a few years after, they never really made any serious attempts there. The Mennonite name, the Amish name in Europe, didn't really come together entirely until really into the late early 1900s finally. And over in this country, they're not completely together yet. All right, now let's talk a little bit about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, William Penn, English Quaker, given land in the New World in America by the king to satisfy a debt to the Penn family, was given this land kind of between New York and Virginia and Maryland, New Jersey. Those were colonies already. Not only did William Penn get a grant from King Charles of England, he also made arrangements with the local Native Americans. And this area that we think of as southeastern Pennsylvania, they agreed to be paid for, and that the English people and others that Penn may invite could settle here. So Penn, in 1682, I believe it was, 83, one of those 2 years, comes over and he lays out this glorious city that is going to be the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. And this is going to be a holy experiment to show the world how Christians should really live. As a Quaker, he believes there's a way to live. Follow the scriptures, follow the inner light of the Holy Spirit. And everybody has that inner light, should be able to live in harmony. And so anyone is pretty much invited to live here. And because of that invitation, this colony grows, and eventually Philadelphia is the largest city in the British colonies in America, right? So Penn actively recruited Quakers from all across Europe, including Germans. And when he went to and sent his agents to the areas where German Quakers lived, many German Quakers had Anabaptist connections. Some of them were Anabaptists before they were Quakers. And so in those areas, a lot of Anabaptists were receptive to the message that William Penn said, come to Pennsylvania, you can live and follow God as the inner light leads, as the Holy Spirit leads you. You can do that. And so from Switzerland and the Palatinate, they went down the Rhine River all the way to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where they would take ships. And the ships would travel back and forth between Rotterdam and some of the port cities on the south coast of England. And then they would sail for America. And you had to sail in an English vessel. That was a rule. The English colonies said that only English ships can dock at their ports. So they sailed on English vessels, and usually the voyage across the ocean took a number of months, and they would hopefully arrive safely near Philadelphia. And the voyage across the ocean was not something that was easy to do. Has anybody here been to Plymouth, where they have that replica of the Mayflower? Can you imagine trying to cross an ocean in a boat that size, or even twice that size? It was usually it was a mind-changing, sort of life-altering experience, and it was also known as it was dangerous, because if you're crowded together on a little vessel like that, sicknesses break out quickly. And a lot of the Anabaptists were moving their whole families. So you have elderly folks, you have children. It was not at all unusual for people to die on the voyage. So it was a serious question for them, some of them, to ask, do I take my family to America or not? Is it safe? Well, not many things in life are not safe, but in particular, there were known risks in doing this, but many of them did just the same. And so they came to America, and in particular in Pennsylvania, and began a number of places where they settle and build houses and start clearing the land for farms. Germantown is the first place where they have a community. In 1685, some Mennonites are part of a group that goes to Germantown. At that point, it was a little bit outside of Philadelphia. Today, it's really just part of Philly. The next several decades, they move a little bit further north to the Skipack area. They call that Franconia. Eventually, even a little further north to Goshenhoppen. And then in 1710, we have some moving to Lancaster County. And from there, in the next several decades, sort of spreading out from the first settlement along the banks of the Pequag Creek in the Willow Street area today, to the area that we call Groffdale, and then Weaverland, and then Hammer Creek and other areas as well. The Lebanon Valley, which at that point was part of Lancaster County, is another one too. If you look at a map more specifically of Lancaster County, you have this sort of first community down here, Strasburg and Willow Street areas. All right, 1710. A lot more come in 1717. A few years after that, we have Hans Groff moving to Groffdale. And a couple years after that, the Weaver brothers, or Weber brothers, or Weber brothers, there are different ways to pronounce it, moving to Weaverland. That's kind of this area. The town of New Holland was not settled by Mennonites, or not created, but on either side, you have a lot of Mennonites living up into the Muddy Creek area, which is called Bowmansville. A little bit west of Lancaster, Rohrstown area, the Hammer Creek area, and then, like I said, other places as well. We also find Amish people coming in 1720s and 30s. It seems like some of the first Amish people to come just became Mennonites. But eventually some came that kind of kept that distinction. The first Amish community was in Berks County along the North Kill Creek. Didn't last more than a couple decades. Others moved into the sort of what became the line between Lancaster and Chester County. Conestoga Mennonite Church is there today, and some others. So Amish people started kind of moving in as well. Later on, others in the colonial era moved out west into the Juniata County area, meaning the west of the Susquehanna River and west of the communities here. Franklin County, and then even just a few years before the American Revolutionary era, some Amish moved to Somerset County. So mostly they're moving to Pennsylvania. There's a handful that moved to Maryland from Franklin County just across the line, and also eventually a few that go to Virginia, but most of them went to Pennsylvania. And they find a sense of peace and prosperity here, all right? Yeah, they may have started in log cabins, but it didn't really take that long until some of them were wealthy enough to erect some pretty substantial structures. This is the house that Christian Herr built. His father Hans lived with him for a while. Hans and Christian were two of the church leaders of the initial settlement in the Pequea area, in Willow Street along the Pequea Creek. That's the oldest building in the county that's still standing. It's sort of a museum now. I'm sure some of you have been to it. Building very substantial buildings to live in, to work in. There's a mill. Become very successful farmers. The Lancaster County is called eventually the garden spot because the soil is very, very fertile, and as the soil is cleared. And this is an area where it was covered under Penn's Treaty with the American Indians, so there was really little, at first, very few, if any, negative interactions with Native Americans and these settlers. And Mennonites were not the only ones, but they were some of the first, and that kind of gave them dibs on the land. All right, so a lot of them did pick areas to farm that were very, very fertile, and they became prosperous farmers. And I think I showed this one other time here, but I like this. This is a picture, presumably, of a Quaker farmer by his attire. So it just shows different aspects of farming in the 1700s. But writing in 1789, Benjamin Rush, physician from Philadelphia, a friend of Benjamin Franklin and an important sort of mover and shaker in the Philadelphia area, writes this about Lancaster County: a German farm may be distinguished from the farms of all other citizens of the state by the superior size of their barns, the plain but compact form of their houses, the height of their enclosures, that's their fences, the extent of their orchards, the fertility of their fields, the luxuriance of their meadows, and a general appearance of plenty and neatness in everything that belonged to them. Maybe that sounds like Lancaster County farms today. All right, it's a long history of agricultural success. All right, and they were innovative farmers. They learned that in the hard way in Europe, and there were things that just is sort of fascinating in Europe, that they weren't allowed to own land in Europe. They were allowed to rent land but not own it. What do you do with your money if you can't buy more land and you're a farmer? Well, one of the things they did was they bought animals, and that led them to get more into animal husbandry, breeding programs, gave them an income from the animals that wasn't tethered directly to their fields and crops. It also led some of them to get into veterinary medicine. Of course, animals produce manure. Manure had been seen by some places in Europe as this sort of waste product that you tried to get rid of, whereas Mennonites used it to fertilize their fields, and they irrigated their meadows and things like that. And they did these things to make these lands that weren't really that easy to farm prosperous. Well, here in Lancaster County, after things are cleared, the soil is very fertile, and so they do all of these things and become, in many cases, very economically prosperous farmers. They also have a sense of peace with regard to their practicing their faith. The Anabaptists in Europe were not permitted really anywhere to entirely freely practice their faith like the people who belonged to the state church. There were always restrictions. It was true. Those restrictions weren't lifted until the 1800s. But in Pennsylvania, they were free to build church buildings, and they eventually started doing that. Some they met in homes early on. Calling leaders from their congregations meant that their congregations could grow and flourish at times better than some of the state churches that in Europe, which required more of an educated ministry and things like that. And so we find religious growth and congregations as time goes by in Lancaster County and beyond in Pennsylvania. And so there begins this period of spreading out. The Conestoga wagon is kind of this archetype in American history, right? This image of westward expansion. The Conestoga wagon, of course, you know, it has to come from this area. This is where the Conestoga is, right? And seems to have been an invention of Lancaster County Anabaptists. Was not really what people traveled around in. It was the 18-wheeler of the 17 and 1800s of the freight wagon, but people did move. Lots of places prior to, say, the Civil War. Here's just a little bit. I'm a very provincial man myself and haven't traveled much, so a lot of these places are just dots on a map, but some of you will say, oh, of course, I've been there. Maybe you're from that area, I don't know. Southeastern Pennsylvania and the Juniata community and sort of the Washington Franklin line in Maryland are kind of these, and Somerset County, some of these sort of old ones that go back to pre-independence days, also the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. But after that, we have places where Mennonites and Amish are living, and they're spreading out, looking for new opportunities for land. In some cases, there are also people coming directly from Europe to these places as well. Some moved to Canada. I think it's Niagara County and Waterloo County and York County there. Number of places in Canada. Canada, of course, is under the English rule at this point after independence. The independence time was not easy for Anabaptists because most of them tended to favor the king, or at least felt it was wrong to rebel against the king because of Paul's writings in the book of Romans about how we should respect our authorities and honor the king. And so some of them seem to have desired to continue under the English government, so they moved to Canada starting in the 1780s. We also find them moving into what becomes the state of Ohio, in the area, I guess a lot of it is homes in Wayne County today, a lot of Amish people there. The western edge, I believe that's Fulton County in Ohio. Indiana, a number of places including Elkhart County there, Elkhart and LaGrange counties near the Michigan line. And also, then we have Amish Mennonites moving to upstate New York, Erie County, Niagara County, Illinois, Tazewell County in the central part of the state, Joe Davis County in the very northwestern part, and then also across the Mississippi in Lee County, Iowa, in the years just before the Civil War. So most of these areas, we kind of see this westward swing, and a little bit to the north. Throughout this period of time, I want to highlight two kind of perennial challenges that Anabaptists, Amish and Mennonites have faced living in America. And each of these could be the subject of, well, if I had you as my students, probably a week or so on each of these maybe. But we're just going to mention them. One of the perennial challenges for our community has been the fact that we conscientiously object to war. We say Jesus' teachings, we're his disciples, we love our enemies, we don't take our enemies' lives. We don't go to war with our enemies. That's not what Jesus calls his disciples to do. It's not how we live. And so in the era that I'm sort of thinking of in American history here, we have the Revolutionary War in the 1775 to 1783. We have the American Civil War in 1861 to 65. And then we have World War I in 1917 and 1918. All of these wars, it was a challenge. In all of these settings, there were Anabaptists who were not confident enough, I guess, if that's the word, confident enough in their beliefs that they decided to join the military and go along with the flow. And there were also lots who said, no, we're not going to change our minds. We understand the scriptures. It's not really that hard to understand what Jesus meant when he says, love your enemies. Well, it's impossible to love an enemy while you're trying to kill them. It just doesn't work that way. And so there were, just to sort of summarize in some ways, during the time of the American Revolutionary War and in the time of the American Civil War, Anabaptists in some settings wound up caring for soldiers. This is a picture that represents how they sent soldiers from the American Continental Army to the Ephrata Cloister. The Ephrata Cloister people were Anabaptists. They were not Mennonites, but there were Mennonites living in the area. The Mennonite pastor and the most closest congregation and his wife both went to the cloister to help. Their names were John and Anna Bear. Both of them got sick from being exposed to the things the soldiers had and died. But there was always a way to not serve in the military if you were an able-bodied man. In the American Civil War as well, you could pay to get out. This is a certificate that certifies that Jacob Harnish of Hempfield Township is quote, getting out of service by paying the fee. All right, so you could pay in lieu of serving. In World War I, in 1900s, that option was not allowed, but in the earlier wars it was. It usually meant that there was a sense of identity. It was reinforced by the time of war. It was a challenge. It was difficult. It showed that the Anabaptists were different than a lot of their neighbors who were going along with the war. This is a little pamphlet that was written by a Lancaster County Mennonite named Daniel Musser called Non-Resistance Asserted. One of the earlier, this is from the Civil War era, 1864. That's a little pamphlet explaining the Anabaptist view. World War I was a little different. There was a draft law with no exceptions. There was no way to pay your way out. So men who were drafted were sent to boot camp. But the law did explain that men were not compelled to take up arms against their conscience, and so nobody quite knew what to do with them. Most of them wound up getting put into detention. Some of them wound up going to prison. Some of them were mistreated pretty badly by other draftees who thought they were cowards or just trying to be difficult. Some of the officers mistreated them, thinking if we just push them a little harder, they'll probably crack, and then they'll put the uniform on and drill like everybody else. And that did happen in some cases. In many cases, it did not. Eventually, kind of after almost a year of not being sure what to do, the government decided that they would allow the military to furlough draftees to farm duty, and a lot of the Mennonites were immediately shifted, and Amish were shifted into that. They called it a farm furlough, and they did not have to be part of the military establishment then. Those who were imprisoned during that difficult time were all eventually, their sentences were commuted, and they were all out of jail by 1920. The second challenge that has been a perennial challenge, it seems like, to Anabaptists is what I call revivalism. in American religious history, we have famous revivalists like Francis Ashbury in the 17 and early 1800s, Charles Finney, more in the middle part of the 1800s, and then by the late 1800s, D.L. Moody, Dwight L. Moody. These were famous evangelists and really set the tenor of American religion, which is, a lot of it is focused on revivalism, which emphasizes an emotional experience of God's grace characterized by a sense of sin and guilt, and then a sense of forgiveness, and almost an overwhelming maybe sense of forgiveness that often in those days was characterized by sort of emotional outbursts and things. And eventually this relationship of the new birth, being born again, being saved. The terminology changes over the centuries, but the concept is fairly similar. Anabaptists didn't disagree with any of that, although as Pennsylvania Dutch, they did tend to not be very emotional people. That's just a hallmark of Germans, I think. Seems to be true of Pennsylvania Germans of all varieties. Some were attracted to this message, and others not so sure. It isn't that the early Anabaptists somehow disparaged the new birth, and it isn't that they felt like there was no room for an emotional experience of salvation, but they tended to filter it through the lens of a conscious decision to be a disciple, to be baptized, and to unite with the church, with the community, and live in as part of the community. As Nevin talked about today, that emphasis isn't just on me and God, but it's on me and God and me and all of you, because we're on this journey together. All right? We don't go to heaven all on our own. We go in the company of others. And that's the perspective that the Anabaptists held. And in some ways, the revivalist message was a little different, presented a challenge. And in the 1700s already, there were revival movements in Lancaster County and surrounding areas among the Germans. Call it sometimes the German Awakening. It's sort of an aspect, a delayed reaction to the Great Awakening of the English people earlier in the 1700s. But we find people circulating and holding meetings in barns and fields and things like that, preaching a message about being born again. In the early 1800s, this kind of became the camp meeting era. People would camp out, in tents, and I guess we go to a United Zion campground. It probably has its roots in this sort of idea of come away for a period of time and, and a lot of it was associated very closely with the Methodist Church, which was a very up-and-coming church in America. And also Baptists did a lot of this. D.L. Moody kind of comes on the scene in the 1870s. He's massive rent and in some cases even erect these huge buildings and urban centers to where he preached, and he became a well-known evangelist and set up his Moody Bible School, and there were Bible conferences and just different things that he was doing. He died in 1899. So this is in this setting, the Anabaptists, Mennonites, and Amish are responding to this. And in some ways, it attracted some. Locally here, Martin Beam was a Mennonite minister, eventually called to be what we would today call a bishop. But he has this experience himself. He promotes it. That was fine among the Mennonites. The other bishops eventually felt compelled to ask him to stop associating with those who, in the context of the American Revolution, are taking up arms and swearing oaths to the new government and all of that, saying that's not the direction we think that you should go. But it's the direction he was going, and eventually he was kind of put out of the ministry by the Mennonites, and he wound up being one of the founders of the United Brethren in Christ. A lot of the, not all, but a lot of the Methodist churches in Lancaster County may have roots to this United Brethren in Christ. They adopted the Methodist name much later. It was essentially a German Methodist sort of church, and he was one of the founders. Later in the 1800s, we find people like Daniel Hoke, who was from Ontario, and Daniel Brenneman from Indiana, who are kind of adapting Methodist methods, and eventually they kind of get pushed out as well, all right? A lot of these people and others in this area too created eventually a denomination. They called it the Mennonite Brethren in Christ. They kind of married together a lot of the revivalistic things that the Methodists were doing with, to some degree, a Mennonite or background. And at first they were continued to be Anabaptist in some of the other aspects, the non-resistance and all. But eventually those things kind of gradually got lost. And the Mennonite Brethren in Christ today is not a name that they use. It hasn't been for a long time. Most of the church is simply called the United Missionary Church. In this area, it's called the Fellowship of Bible Churches. We have one in our town where I live in Terry Hill, kind of on the edge of town. That has its roots in this movement. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that to a lot of Mennonites and Amish, this is a lot of emotionalism, a lot of hype, maybe some signs of pride. And they also point out that most of the people who jump on this sort of bandwagon eventually don't identify anymore as Anabaptists at all. By the late 1800s, though, there were Mennonite figures, and Amish, some Amish too, that said there are aspects of this that we should have in our churches too. All right? And so there's a sort of era, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of historians now call it the Mennonite quickening or the quickening. John F. Funk was probably one of the main proponents. He was born in Franconia area, but he spent much of his life in Indiana. And he said, we need to do more. Our churches need to do a lot more. We need to be more active. And he promoted Sunday schools. It was an idea that the Methodists had really latched onto, and other churches as well, the Sunday schools and revival meetings. He worked closely with John S. Kaufman from Virginia, who eventually moved to Indiana as well. Kaufman became a well-known Mennonite evangelist. He was more, I guess in some ways, respectful of some of the Mennonite traditions. They both supported, for example, the idea of plain distinctive, plain attire. And he wasn't incredibly emotional. He was an earnest preacher, is what I gather from things that were recorded about him. He was an earnest preacher, but he wasn't a pulpit pounder or anything like that. They started mission work, organized missions. 1893, these are some of the earliest Mennonite missionaries to the Chicago Home Mission, started in 1893. And to support mission work, a few years later, they have another one in Philadelphia. Also, they start some mission work in India in 1898, I believe, 1899. And that's the first foreign mission work that the American Anabaptists are doing. This is a picture of a sewing circle. Sewing circles were sort of an idea to have a Mennonite equivalent of the ladies' missionary societies that a lot of the other churches had. Ladies would get together and produce things sometimes, or whatever, clothing, food to support the mission work. And that idea has long roots in Lancaster County, starting in the mid-1890s. Other institutions were started, Mennonite Publishing Company. These are students from Goshen College in its early days. Goshen, Indiana is the site of one of the earliest Mennonite colleges. So we have various institutions. So there's lots of things that are happening. Mennonites are saying we can do these things, and it doesn't become a threat to our identity, and it can be worked in with our understanding of the Christian life. And many of these things are taking place. But there is also, with that, a spirit of assimilation, because these are ideas that they are getting from the sort of broader American Christian tradition. And that is a sense of assimilation and becoming a little more similar. One of the huge things that's an aspect of that is simply the switch to English, where a lot of the Mennonites, and eventually some of the Amish as well, switch primarily to the English language from the German. And that has can have a lot of implications. But it's part of this process of becoming a little more like all of their neighbors. Now, for the last 100 years or more, one of the things that's been characteristic of Mennonites and Amish is a question of how much assimilation is acceptable, how much can we And to what degree do we need to be separate? It's not so much a matter of saying all or the other, okay? It's a matter of trying to find just the right balance, all right? Roll things back 50 years, the term for separateness was probably nonconformity. And some of you, that term may ring a bell, or it may be something you grew up with. For some of the younger ones in the audience, it may be a fairly meaningless term. But the idea behind it is that a person who is committed to Jesus as a disciple and says, Jesus is my Lord, is going to live a life that is different and separate from those who haven't made that commitment. And, there's a number of verses that we could sort of appeal to talk a little bit about that. Paul tells us not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and we know that's a reference to the work of the Holy Spirit. Paul also, quoting from the Old Testament, talks about the idea that we should come out from the ungodly and become God's sons and daughters. All right, so it's a matter of separating ourselves from what's wicked and separating ourselves to God, who is holy, and that will make that in turn we become holy as God. It's a process we call sanctification, right? As God works in our lives, and we become more like Christ. There were Mennonites and Amish right off the bat who said, we don't want to be like the world, and these things that you are introducing are not the direction we want to go. The Amish kind of sorted things out starting in the 1860s, in some areas to the 1890s. So there's a lot of varieties of Amish. The Old Order Amish are the ones who kind of keep that name today mostly, and they kept to the Old Order and did not assimilate much at all. They kept a lot of they kept out a lot of those innovations as they saw them from the quickening era. Whereas others became known as Amish Mennonite conferences in the same time. These are some pictures of some of them. They may not look very much like they assimilated much, but the very fact that they were photographed at all is a sign that they were taking a new approach to a lot of things. All right, so these are church leaders. This man was from Lancaster County. This other man was from Illinois. They gradually sort of started conferences, and gradually the Amish aspect was moved and dropped, and they just became Mennonites. Okay? In between those kind of two divisions, we have others that try to kind of come to a little different line on the assimilation versus separateness. We have the conservative Amish Mennonite conference starting around 1910. All right, and there's no Lancaster County equivalent to this. The nearest congregations were in Maryland and Delaware. I think there's some in the middle part of the state, but probably a little further away than Maryland would be from us here. All right, and then a couple decades later, the Beachy Amish Mennonites, and that has a long root in this area. Starting with the Weavertown congregation already in 1909. One of the things about the Amish Mennonites of any variety is that they favored assimilation on a couple areas. One of the things that they always did is they dropped shunning. The old orders kept it, but not any of the Amish Mennonites. They always dropped that. They also all fairly quickly adopted meeting houses where old orders meet in homes. And most of them fairly quickly adopted more forms of modern technology. Modern technology was not necessarily the thing that drove the old order divisions. It was more a matter of how to respond to the changing American religious scene and some of those innovations they talked about, Sunday schools, etc. But technology quickly became a sort of a practical flashpoint in a lot of those movements, and all of them today, all of the old orders would restrict certain forms of technology, whether it's automobiles or telephones or what. The various issues came up. Among the Mennonites, There were old order divisions as well in the late 1800s. We have one in Ohio and Indiana, a number of congregations there, including one in Michigan for a while that was affiliated with Ohio. And then in Ontario in 1887. Locally here in Pennsylvania, 1893, Jonas Martin, Bishop of the Weaverland District, sort of pushed out by the other bishops, and a lot of people in his district followed him into what's called the Weaverland Conference. And then we have another one in Virginia a few years later. All of the Old Order Mennonite divisions in all of these areas eventually, within a matter of decades, split into two wings over modern technology, for lack of a better term. And one wing, eventually, if it wasn't the flashpoint, one of the wings would go with cars and automobiles, and others stuck with horses and buggies. So you find that kind of in all of these areas among Old Order Mennonites. All right, 1940. World War II sort of begins in Europe in the year before, and the U.S. isn't involved yet. The president signs a law instituting a peacetime draft because it seems like the country might be at war soon. And the following year, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the country here is at war. World War II is a little different because they set up a program right from the start called alternative service. In this case, it was called civilian public service. And more or less, and I want to be careful I don't say the wrong thing, but more or less, if you were a young man of draft age and you were either a member of your church or you were raised in your church and believed that even if you hadn't taken the step of being baptized, you basically could get into alternative service without too many questions being asked, and you weren't really given a hard time. All right? It was not hard to do it. It did involve a level of I don't know if interview is quite the word, but there were cases where people who maybe applied for it were asked a few hard questions to make sure that their beliefs really did line up with what they were saying. But by and large, it wasn't too hard to get into civilian public service. It wasn't entirely a nice thing to be. You didn't have to serve in the Army. You had to serve in something else. The government gave work, and it was for no pay, but you didn't have to serve if you didn't want to. And this was due to the efforts of something that was developed there as they were drafting legislation in 1940 called the National Service Board for Religious Objectors. They said, we would like our young men to be able to do service to the country that's not military. And some of the people here are Mennonites in that picture. That's the board. Some of them were Quakers and Brethren. And so they set this program up, and they gave young men work. Some of them were doing sort of like conservation work. That was initially what a lot of them did. Some of them were, trained to fight forest fires and things like that. A few of them got into sort of agricultural work. And then by the middle of the war years, about 1943 and then to the end, most of them were given jobs in hospitals, and especially mental hospitals, where they served as orderlies, sort of just taking care. They weren't obviously trained to do medical care for the people in these institutions, but they were able to give them personal care and help them with their daily routines. And so that's what young men were allowed to do. After World War World War II ended in 1947, the program went away. But when they revived the draft in 1951 for the Korean conflict, and this lasted through the Vietnam one, and there was a status you could call, it was usually called 1W. And there again, people could go into alternative service. Some of them served as sort of in VS type work. Others worked in hospitals and things like that. And I guess if you want to ask him about it sometime, you can ask Paul, who's our only one, I think, in our congregation who would have personal experience in this. But one of the things I want to say is that it was still not easy to be an Anabaptist, all right? If you could go into these programs, and many young men did, it didn't mean that they were well liked. The government in some ways pushed them into places where more or less the a lot of people they didn't get a lot of public recognition because they knew there would be outcry. In a setting like this where telegrams were probably being sent to people in every week saying, we have unfortunate news that your son died in Europe or over fighting the Japanese, to have young men from their Mennonite neighbors who weren't exposed to those kinds of dangers did mean that there was a sense of tension, hostility. Conscientious objectors were not well liked, just because. In the Vietnam era, eventually, I don't think there was quite so much of that hostility because many people in the American public by the latter part of that war didn't think the war was worth fighting, and so it wasn't really seen as necessarily that bad of a thing to be against the war. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is it wasn't really that hard to get into an alternative program. Some of the men who did it were just pushed that way by their parents and their churches and didn't necessarily have a lot of their own beliefs, but many of them did. In spite of that, about 45% of the Mennonite young men drafted in World War II actually went into CPS. 38% went into regular military duty, and the others went into non-combatant military duty. In the Vietnam era, it's estimated that maybe 55 or maybe 60% of the Mennonite young men went into 1W, with the idea that, again, a very sizable minority chose to go into regular military duty. And so that becomes kind of a thing that troubled a lot of church leaders, to see the number of young men decide not to live that peace, non-resistance idea. In the years after the war ended in the 50s, even before in the 1920s, 30s, markers of separateness sort of became a lot of attention given. Some of this is related perhaps to Daniel Kaufman, a well-known Mennonite church leader who wrote Doctrines of the Bible and some other tomes of doctrinal content. But it emphasized that if we live a life of discipleship, we should be different from the world. And one of the aspects, we avoid personal vices. And in a lot of ways, that's no different than many other Christians would always have taught. You don't drink. In this case, they would say you don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't swear. Those are signs that Christians shouldn't do those things, and we probably agree. Well, that's very true. There was a lot of Mennonites and Amish have always had a very tentative, I would say, relationship with entertainment technology. And so when things come out, we're usually not too eager to jump on board. Some of them are, some aren't. But in this era, when the radio came out, Mennonites and Amish said no radio. Eventually that kind of said, well, what about television? Well, no television, all right? And so those things were part of it. And also then attire. Increasingly in the 1930s and 40s, I would say, to some degree after that, the way you dress was seen as a significant marker of separation from the world. And this picture shows some Mennonite mission workers in Reading in the 20s, and this is the kind of clothing that was expected for a man, for a lady, for children. Dark shoes, dark clothing. In that picture, I don't know what the exact colors are. The man's suit is probably black, and the specific attire varied a bit over time, and it varied from group to group, but in some ways the concept was the same. I want to just state right now, I'm sorry if I'm boring some of you, and it's dragging. I do intend to wrap up soon. Okay, I'm aware that it is 7:45. All right, but I do have a few more things I think are important just to sort of explain explains the present by looking at the past. A lot of effort by the church leaders to put into those distinctive things, those markers of separateness from the world, put in place. But in the 1950s, after the war, in the economic boom time, a lot of this was difficult to navigate because a lot of Mennonites were moving to the mainstream. And of course, the Amish Mennonites, who were kind of latched onto the Mennonite name by this time, were doing the same thing. The Old Order movements, to some degree, stand apart from this movement to some degree, but they're affected by it too. But we find a lot of Mennonites going from agricultural farming settings to working in offices and other kinds of things. And that's a shift, and it's a big shift in some ways, you're working with people who probably, rather than just with animals, you're working with people who may believe differently than you, and it makes a difference in how you think. It broadens your horizons. A lot of the people who went into CPS and 1W service who returned to would also have said that this really broadened my horizons to go somewhere else and work and live with people who were a little different than what I was used to growing up. And so, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, depending where you were, this started in the 60s. If you lived here in Lancaster County, this really in some ways didn't get underway too significantly among the Mennonites until the 1980s. Is this process that kind of gradually starts often more in the Midwest and moves its way east. All right, but this calling this moving to the mainstream. A lot of the markers of distinction were gradually dropped. All right, you'll look at a picture here where you have a number of, this is a Mennonite family, but some of them are not dressing quite the same as mom and dad anymore. They may not all be Mennonites in that family. I have no idea. I just found the picture on the web a few years ago. I don't know whose family it is. By the 70s, sadly, some of the 70s fashions were being adopted by some of the young people. I say it's sad because everybody knows that look was just pretty poor, right? Now, I'm a product of growing up in the 80s, so we said everything 70s was what Dad wore. So, of course, I'm not wearing what my dad wore. You guys may have, you have your perspectives on it. Hairstyles are changing. Women aren't wearing coverings as much. And eventually, Mennonites look like a normal American family. All right? There's not really any mark of distinction on the outside. I'm not saying that these are people who assimilated in their spirits and they're conformed to the world. I am saying the markers of separation have dropped, and in some cases are gone. Entertainment technology as well. We have eventually the radio is kind of accepted. Well, we could use the radio to spread the gospel. That would be a good purpose for it. You have people like George Brunk in the 1950s and on for a period of decades with these huge tent revivals. Look at that sea of cars there in Lancaster County, people going to hear him preach. And his message he was a revivalist, and his message was very solidly Anabaptist in so many ways. But the method he's using was clearly borrowed from Billy Graham, all right, with that whole idea of the mass tent crusade. Very popular in that era with a lot of other people who were clearly not Mennonites, like George Brunk was. But it had a lot of positive things on one hand, but it's also another sign where things aren't doing. Eventually in the 60s and 70s, the charismatic movement kind of affects Mennonites to some degree in some places and some settings. It did here in Lancaster County to some degree, and some of the markers, whereas a generation ago there was a question over whether it was even appropriate to have musical instruments in your home, much less in church. It's now perfectly acceptable to bring them as part of the worship experience. Another marker of distinction or separation that sort of goes. Some Mennonites in the 70s already begin ordaining women as pastors. The feminist movement has its impact here. Beginning, and that gradually gathers speed as we move towards the end of the century. More recently, in the last several decades, the sort of the pacifist movement, direct action to oppose violence and other social ills has become very, very much a part of the mainstream Mennonite identity. As well lately as the queer thing, and that's roiled a lot of feathers for the last 20 years, and it seems to some degree that it's not stopping quite yet along the mainstream. So you have Mennonites today come in a host of options, from very traditional types to very, very progressive types, and their theologies are all quite different in some ways. In the context of that move to the mainstream, there is a reaction. And some of us would probably find ourselves a little more identifying with this as our specific background for some of us. But there is this conservative Mennonite movement that says that we don't want to keep assimilating into the general patterns, and some of those markers of distinctive lifestyle, those markers of separation are important because they'll keep us on a path where we feel we can follow Jesus and not become conformed to the world, as Paul warns us about. So we have church leaders starting in the 50s and 60s who sort of break away from the mainstream and start churches on their own, congregations, to kind of uphold some of the lifestyle practices. I will say, in the early days of the conservative Mennonite movement, 50s, 60s, 70s, that the issues at hand were primarily matters, we would say, of practice, not matters of doctrine. That has changed to some degree since the year 2000 and thereabouts. But most of the decisions were made related to practical matters. But underlying a lot of those practical matters was this whole idea of, to what degree do we want to be like the rest of the world? To what degree do we want to keep these markers of separation so that we can be separated unto God and be His sons and daughters and live a Christian life as He wants us to? As the conservative Mennonite movement sort of gathers some steam by the 70s and 80s, and since, we find a lot of organizations starting. Christian Light Publications started in '69 as kind of an alternative to the mainstream Mennonite institutions of publishing things. Christian Aid Ministries, in some ways, is a more conservative, somewhat maybe more conservative version of MCC. In some ways, the Mennonite Central Committee. Faith Builders starting to provide educational opportunities in a venue much different than the Mennonite colleges that existed at the time. A lot of these groups, networks of churches or conferences pulled out of others and formed their own smaller ones, start their own Bible schools, and engage in mission activity around the world, whether it's Africa, Central America, or whatever. So I would say that probably our congregation and the background that many of us come from, we could probably identify fairly closely with this conservative Mennonite movement and be familiar with the fact that there are a wide variety of conservative Mennonites, and many of us, especially if you're from the area here where there's a lot of variety, and if you pay attention to these details, some cases can almost pigeonhole somebody on what kind of church they probably go to based on how they dress, because the idea of how we dress is still a marker of separateness in a lot of conservative settings. It's seen now. Here's a picture, and I'm not going to say for sure. I just grabbed these from the web. I don't know these people. Some of them you might know. But they are varieties of conservative Anabaptists, probably Mennonites, I would think, in most cases. And while there are some differences, there are also some similarities in what we would call modest apparel, modest attire, and the ladies wear a veiling of some sort to signify that they are a Christian, and so on. And yes, for some of you who are into websites and podcasts, this is Asher Whitmer. I don't really follow him. I did find, occasionally have seen some things, and I grabbed a picture there. All right, so we have this movement. We're not all on the same page exactly. I would like to think that underneath it all, we have somewhat the same vision and goals, no matter if we do live in slightly different ways. And I would like to just conclude tonight by saying that it feels like this is a continuing vision. All right? It's a continuing vision. The Anabaptist vision is a continuing vision because of a continuing call. Right? Jesus still calls us to follow Him, to be His disciples. And the aspects that we mentioned this morning that can be seen as part of the Anabaptist heritage, which I think is important. It's something, as Levon pointed out, it's not that we lift up our heritage or romanticize it or idolize it, as much as a recognition that it can be and I think ought to be a valuable piece of who we are as we strive to follow Jesus together. So the Christian life is a life of discipleship, right? The church is a community of believers, and Jesus calls his disciples to live in love and peace with others. We mentioned them this morning in different ways. Nevin did, Lavon did, here I am again. As we think of these as sort of core, essential aspects of the Anabaptist vision, my hope is that it continues. I don't know if we have 500 more years. I don't have 500 more years, but I want to live this way for the years that I do have, and I want to raise my family in a way that my children can catch some of that vision as well and carry it in their lives. And I think that probably all of us feel a sense of something similar and say, there is something here for us. There's something here for us. And it's really because there is someone who is calling us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, well done. That was a blessing to get a little bit of, I probably am right in saying a little bit of the historical knowledge that you picked up over the years. Amen to your concluding thoughts as well. I'm not going to try to add anything to it other than I'll ask you to stand, turn to 160 in Hymns of the Church. We'll sing, "O God, our help." 160 as a recognition that people have interacted with God in many ways throughout time. We saw a little slice of time here in what Dan shared, and we continue on in this journey of coming together and following God together. So a call to our Lord to be with us in that.